Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for being here this morning. Well, first of all, I just wanted to start off by saying that Jamal and I didn't actually talk before we stood up together on this platform this morning, but I'm astounded at how similar some of the messages that we've got. So thank you very much for what was an excellent introduction. I have to say, as I was coming up here, I feel a little bit embarrassed because I notice I've managed to wear the same shirt and tie as the publicity photo. So I guess I should start by reassuring you that I do, in fact, have more than one shirt. Okay, so let's get going. Now, Falanx, my company, is listed on the London Stock Exchange, and we specialise in cyber consulting, in security monitoring, and in intelligence. And if you'd like to follow us and follow me, you can follow me on Twitter at Cyberspook. Now, we've got a lot to cover this morning, so I shall get straight to it. I'm going to talk for just under an hour, and there will be a chance for some questions at the end. I'm first going to talk about the cyber market and why it is growing like crazy. Secondly, I'm going to be rather controversial because I'm going to tell you that the cyber war is more about people than it is about fancy technology, and that actually looking at people is a better predictor of what is going to happen than technology, which is changing very, very quickly at the moment. And then finally, I couldn't talk in the Lloyd's building without actually talking about cyber insurance. Now, I'm a cyber guy, I'm not an insurance guy, but the headlines are already becoming clear. And probably the most important one for you to take away is that cyber insurance is growing at 30 to 40% per year for the next 5 years. All right. The very first point that I want to make is that cyber is still very, very young. Now, whilst viruses have been around for 20 years or so, the real problems only really kicked in at around about 2008 to 2012. And we saw the emergence of state-sponsored threats. We saw the first major financial losses, and these were driven by advanced payloads, targeted attacks, and zero-day exploits. And we also started to see the first major attacks on industrial control systems. As Jamal has mentioned, we saw the power grid shut down in the Ukraine, and we've started to see more hacks in oil and gas. And these were all kicked off by a program known as Stuxnet. Now infamous, Stuxnet was actually designed to attack the Iranian nuclear weapons program. In 6 months, it infected 50,000 PCs around the world. For most, it did nothing. It was silent. But if any of those systems were actually connected to any of Iran's centrifuges, well, bingo. And in fact, that program shut down more than a quarter of Iran's processing capacity in a matter of weeks. Now, when you look at the code for Stuxnet, it looks like it took about 5 man-years to write. And there was no financial payoff for it. So it's generally regarded as government development. And I'll let you speculate on which of the two governments who are accused of preparing Stuxnet that it really was. But it was very clearly the first digital weapon of war, and it opened Pandora's box for all other industrial control systems around the world. And more recently, as you've mentioned, we've seen the emergence of ransomware, that your PC is encrypted, you have to pay to get your data back, and it's been a money spinner, and it's actually taken cyber into new areas. In particular, it's been a threat in healthcare, who've now joined the front line for very much the first line in the last few years. So because of that, we've all got pretty used to endless bad news stories coming out of cyber. You've all heard, I'm sure, of the TalkTalk attack. Let me just mention a few things about that. The first point, and it's the first time I'll point to people rather than technology, it's not a sophisticated attack. When the vulnerability used to attack you is older than the teenager that did it. Secondly, they got fined £400,000. because they got hacked not once, they got hacked 4 times last year, and the regulator was pretty fed up with them. 400k for a firm. I think someone's been hacked. So, TalkTalk turnover 1.8 billion a year. Just how significant do you think a 400k fine is for them when it's less than the cost of 2 or 3 security people or a bit of corporate software? And thirdly, the CEO, Dido, not the singer, Dido Harding, showed us all how not to respond. She was absolutely crucified on television, and she'd been poorly prepared by her staff. And it really underlines the importance of being prepared to respond when you are hacked. Now, Tesco's bank also got hacked last autumn. Now, Tesco's actually responded rather well in my book. They were attacked on a Saturday evening by several hundred people using mobile phone payment systems in Brazil and the US. Now, Tesco's responded quickly. Their technology controls prevented a major loss. They actually lost 2.5 million, and everyone said, well, that's a big number, isn't it? No, it is not. We're aware of a Bangladeshi bank that lost over 60 million in one transaction last year. However, Tesco's was still a bad job. It was a complete intelligence failure. There was a clear trail of evidence before the hack. Lots of people had posted about the weakness online. 2 security companies had even written to Tesco's to tell them about it, but it had been dismissed as sales talk. So the key learning points from these 2 stories: yes, fast technology action is important. It minimises losses. It really helped Tesco's. But people and threat intelligence is even more important, because in this case, it would have stopped the losses at Tesco's altogether. Now, all this pain, about 6 trillion of losses around the world, is driving a huge market in cybersecurity, and the market's growing at around about 12 to 15% per year. And most existing cyber users are going to have to double their expenditure over the next couple of years. So JP Morgan would be an example. Last year alone, they doubled their expenditure from 250 million to 500 million. 500 million, just one bank. And the government, of course, is trying to raise the bar for the whole of the UK. Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, announced in November a new cyber programme for the UK, an investment of 1.9 billion. I still actually think that's rather small if one bank is spending 500 million, but nonetheless, they've spoken and they've said the right things. And possibly more influential over the longer run, if you now want to do business with Her Majesty's government, you must have a Cyber Essentials certificate first. Otherwise, they won't give you the work. So if that's a bit about the market and a bit about the hype, let's talk about the reality. So the reality is 100% of UK firms last year faced attacks by viruses and Trojans. 81% of them admit that they were hacked. 69% of them said that they had downtime. Their clients couldn't be serviced, they couldn't get into their own systems. And the percentage that actually had a plan to deal with any of that, 31%. Which means 69% of them were simply in denial. And I do not mean a North African river. So, what's going on? The truth is that many companies have just abdicated their cyber responsibilities. It's just too hard. And there are 3 usual excuses for this. Number 1, let's just keep quiet. No one will notice us. We're not big enough. Security through obscurity. In fact, all you're doing is playing Russian roulette. Number 2, hey, you know what? The fines aren't that big, 400k for TalkTalk. Let's just pay the fines when they happen. It's going to be cheaper, isn't it? And then number 3, and I hear this one a lot, I use Amazon. or some other similar company for my cloud outsourcing, I'm going to be all right. Well, Amazon is in fact a fine service, but it is not an end-to-end cybersecurity service, and you are not assured simply by using them. So, why does this matter to you in this room? And the answer to that is because a whole bunch of these companies are going to be approaching you for cyber insurance in the next 2 to 3 years, despite the fact that they have taken no countermeasures to protect themselves. And this is why they're going to be beating a path to your door. Because in May 2018, there's new legislation coming in from the EU, the General Data Protection Requirement. Now, Brexit won't stop this, because this is scheduled to land first in May 2018, which is less than the 2 years that required to give notice and to leave the EU. And in actual fact, the UK government does not want to avoid this anyway. The UK Information Commissioner has announced that we will implement this, and as part of the Great Repeal Bill, if and when it comes, this will be incorporated into British law. And the reality is that most companies are unprepared. It introduces new rights. The right to be forgotten. The right not to be profiled through your online surfing. It'll be needed by companies to allow them to passport their data. And it has real teeth, because you can be fined up to 5% of your global turnover. Now, if you remember TalkTalk, again, I'm not just picking on them, but it's a really good example. That 400k fine, under this new regulation, that fine could have been 90 million. So companies will no longer be able to abdicate on cybersecurity, not when most of your annual profit is at stake and you get hacked 81% of the time. And then, of course, the final big issue for cyber is the complete lack of enough people, a global talent shortage. Estimates at the last RSA conference are that we're about 1.5 million people short. And what that means is that companies are not going to be able to build their in-house capability. They won't have the firepower or critical mass to put up a decent cyber defence, and they will increasingly need to go to external security as a service providers. Okay, let's change gear, let's flip the coin and look at this, the other side of the coin, at the people who are doing this to us. And remember, it's not the technology doing this to us, it's other people. Technology is just the tool. And in my view, the people view is a better predictor of what to expect and how to defend. So I firmly believe that no talk on hacking is complete without at least one quote from Sun Tzu and The Art of War. So here we go. Now, even though this quote is 2,500 years old, it's still relevant. And it's still relevant because I think cyber is a people problem, not a technology problem. So here we go. If you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. And if you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. So, talk. They didn't know themselves. They didn't know their enemy either. They were hacked by a 16-year-old novice. Talk's vulnerability was older than the teenager. And actually, the perpetrator was quickly tracked down, if you remember, within 24 hours. He didn't even know enough to cover his tracks. That's how much of a novice he was. Tesco's bank had put in the middle. They did know themselves, but they didn't know their enemy. They had sophisticated systems. They minimised their loss to 2.5 million. And that was a pretty good result, given that the attack was highly automated. Whoever did it created hundreds of mobile phone accounts. They deployed dozens of people at the same time to shops across Brazil and the United States. And they did it deliberately on Saturday evening UK time. These were not amateurs. This was organised. It was well planned. But the hackers had been talking about Tesco's weaknesses for months. There were people in chat rooms who were saying that they were making £1,000 a week out of Tesco's by hacking them. And therefore Tesco's did not look at their enemy, they just looked at themselves. They did not see the advanced scouts, they did not see the enemy moving against them. They should have. It was an intelligence failure. But they did respond quickly. We must give them the credit for that. So let's have a quick look then at our evil mastermind. Most of them are teenagers or in their early 20s, like Gareth here. Most are only a few years older than the Talk hacker. And most of them, yes, they really do start in the bedroom. And my contention is that beating Gareth is more about understanding him and his habits and his psychology than it is in his tech. So Gareth starts off as a novice, as a script kiddie, that's what they're known as in the business, and he can go on to be an online terrorist or a hacktivist. If he does, he's not motivated by money. It's ideological. He's after the headlines and advancing his cause. Or Gareth can be recruited by government to be a cyber warrior. They get absolutely fantastic training. Again, it's not financial. And these guys are often the hardest to detect because their job is to find your weakness and then not exploit it. They don't want to rip you off. They don't want you to fix the hole. They want to keep it ready for the revolution. So the reality is that most commercial organisations cannot defend themselves from these guys. But fortunately, these guys don't often bother with companies. It's national infrastructure, security, and even allegedly US elections that they are now after. And then, of course, I'm trying to recruit Gareth. He's a great addition to my company. And we take lots of interns and train them to become commercial cyber warriors, to defend others for money, for their living. But actually, it's the second group of four that we really need to worry about. They are more of more concern. Social engineers are people who trick our staff into giving away information. The cyber criminal who's in it for the millions, highly professional and better than we are. The IPR thief whose job is to steal your designs and give it to a factory so they can knock them off. And possibly the most difficult to manage is our own staff. Disgruntled employee of the month. Or possibly because of social engineering, deceived and hack employee of the month. And it's these four that we really need to manage. So if it's these people who are doing it, the next question is where are they doing it and how? And the answer is the dark web. And what is that? Technically, it's any part of the internet that you can't reach by using a search engine like Google or Bing. And most people are surprised to hear that that is 96% of the internet. Why do you go there? Because it's essentially lawless. You can find narcotics, credit card details, armaments, child pornography, assassins, hackers for hire, you name it, you can buy it there. And it's also the education ground for hackers. It's where they form clubs, it's where they share methods, and it's where they sell data. And where is it? Well, it's in plain sight. All you have to do is type the right numbers into the address bar at the top of your screen. And the issue, of course, is if you do that, well, you're pretty easily traced, like the Talk guy, because law enforcement is onto this. So the cyber criminals use the onion router, or Tor. And this sends messages through multiple computers. Each adds its own layer of encryption, and no one actually knows where the message is going or where it came from or what the message is, because no one computer can decode the message. Now, how did something so incredibly useful come into existence? Well, it was invented by the US military to protect their own communications, and it has now been co-opted by the criminals. I guess the final point is to say that is the dark web all bad? Well, no, it isn't actually. There are legitimate reasons for using it. You can find human rights activists here avoiding persecution. You can find journalists talking to their sources. Military use it to communicate. Law enforcement are there to try and do what they can to manage it. And you get regular people like you and me there too. So what does it look like? What does this dark web actually look like then? Well, actually, it looks rather familiar because one of the things about the dark web is that there's no copyright there. So this is Silk Road. It's a famous dark web market. It's closed now, so I'm quite happy to talk openly about it. But there are many other examples of this live right now. And this was a market for almost anything. Does anyone fancy some ecstasy? Can I perhaps offer you some hash? Or maybe serve Viagra as your thing. So, it's just like eBay. And I can even use it, if you look up here, custom orders. I can get stuff stolen to order as well. And just like eBay, every time you use it, you get feedback and you get a reputation. Because after all, a good criminal needs to know who he can trust. So, if Silk Road and organised crime is the end point, how do people get there? How do our kids and our colleagues end up in these places? And really what I'd like to do is spend a couple of minutes talking about the highway to hell, because this is really important for our policymakers if you're a parent or you're an educator. And it actually starts off, as you'd expect, with millions and millions of kids playing computer games. Nothing wrong with that, but some of them like to cheat at computer games, some of them like to modify them, and through that process they get into hack forums and they start to learn about what the real potential of their skills is and how wide open the rest of the world really is. And there are a real couple of worries about this. Number one is their actions become progressively more illegal. Yeah, I mean, how many people think that downloading music without paying for it is a really major crime? And the reality is, for most of our kids, it's the first step on the road to illegality. It's the first time that they decide they can ignore copyright and other people's rights. And what you find, the other thing that's worrying, is how little we actually track what's going on. How early in that process parents and educators lose sight of what their kids are doing. And we really, really need, as a policy, to help our parents and our educators understand this story more, how to look out for when their kids start to get into hack forums, and then, of course, further down the line, of course, we need more professional intervention. I gave this talk actually to a bunch of cyber people in the NHS, and I spoke to one of them afterwards, and he said, you know, I was one of these guys, I was here, I nearly got caught, and I decided that actually I wanted to go to the light side. And he is now one of the key defenders of one of the NHS trusts. I just wanted to tell you that because this is real, it isn't a story, and actually it's a real live experience for most of us who work in the cyber industry. So, if that's the shape of how you become a hacker, it also shapes the criminal organisations. It starts off with people at the bottom doing basic learning how to do hacks. People progress through this by developing their reputations, getting good feedback for participating in minor crime, until they become more senior developers, they get skilled, they start writing their own malware, their own versions of Stuxnet, and then finally, when they've really proven themselves, they become one of the top cyber criminals in that organisation. And that journey might only take them 3 or 4 years. They still might be in their teens or early 20s when they get there. But it also gives the organisations a bit of a soft underbelly too. It means that we can penetrate them, and that's why building reputation is so important in the cyber criminal world. So if that's what a criminal organisation looks like, how many of these are there? So for me, this is one of the most sobering slides that I use, because the reality is that there are dozens and dozens of these organizations, and you can see clusters of them in America, in China, in Korea, and in Russia. And actually, just a reminder, we are dealing with Gareth, remember? We've got things like Flying Kitten, yeah? We've got Dark Soul. You know, these are little in-jokes by people who really are still teenagers at heart. So if that's what we're dealing with, if we're dealing with organised crime, one of the most important messages I want to give you today is that they may be criminal, but they are still rational. And if you can understand that, then actually you can manipulate them, and we can use that. So probably the most important thing to think about is to change their cost benefit. And it's really important to understand that it costs a lot of money to run one of these criminal empires. Laundering money is expensive. Everyone needs a big slice to be paid for their risk, and therefore a pound stolen by them is actually only worth pence to them. So you only have to get them to spend more than a few pence, and they won't attack you. So your security does not have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough. So if we give some examples here, A and B have the same financial gain for hackers, but B is harder to hack and it's not financially worth it. Yeah? B will be okay. C is also interesting. With that much financial gain, it's probably a bank. And it's actually the hardest of them all to hack. But it is still a big target. It is still worth hacking. So the key point is that there is a low hack zone to aim for, to get into. And the issue is to work out how much, or rather how little, you need to spend to get into the low hack zone. And let's be clear, it's not a no hack zone. Some actors are not financially motivated, and the benefit line is not always as clear as it looks on a pretty chart. But the key principle is to think about their cost benefit, not yours, and to make it harder for them to hack and to limit their financial gains. Now, of course, life can be a little bit messier than that. So the criminals have excellent tools, and most of us are in fact vulnerable to being hacked. So A, B and C here, they're all banks. They are all vulnerable. They're all worth hacking. But in this scenario, you do not want to be bank B. That's the bad bank. You do not want to be the weakest one. Why? Because it's the old bear joke, right? If you can't outrun the criminals, if you at least outrun your competitors, the hackers will go somewhere else. Yeah? None of the people in this picture can outrun the bear, but the guy the bear will get is this guy who's suddenly fallen over at the back. You do not want to be him. And that's really interesting, because it says your safety is as much about what your competitors are doing as the hackers are doing. Okay, the next key principle to understand is the kill chain. Now, when people hack an organisation, they follow a common approach. First, they scout out who might be vulnerable, they probe for weakness, they use the weakness to penetrate you, they take control of your systems, they do a survey, they find out where your juicy data is, and then they get it off your systems and they sell it to somebody else. And you can track this behaviour because it doesn't happen all at once. And it's not all done by the same person. There are weakness specialists. There are people who specialise in penetration. There are surveyors. And they work in gangs, or they sell the leads to each other on the dark net. And because of that, you can actually spot and track what they're doing. If you spot the patterns, then you know early when you're being attacked. And you can also use this to design multiple barriers against them. Now, there are usually a lot of barriers up front in cyber, passwords, gateways, penetration testing. But a good company will also make it difficult to maneuver inside the organizations. They'll use multi-level security architectures. And they'll actually look for when the HR person starts being interested in the finance systems, when their behavior changes. Why would their behavior change? Possibly because they've been hacked or they're disgruntled employee of the month. And then at the end, even at the end, you can still stop them because they've got to get your data off-site. And if you just watch what's leaving all your systems and all your networks, and close those if you see something that you're going out, then you can stop them. And that's known as managing data exfiltration. And you can also try and get them to make mistakes. Put up a big, fat, juicy-looking database, make it look like it's got lots of valuable data, but it's fake. And watch for the people sniffing around it. Your first sign of attack. And that's known as honeypotting in the business. So, to do this, every company needs two very distinct functions. The first function is about cyber threat intelligence. It's about looking outside your organisation at what the hackers are doing and what your competitors are doing. And the second function, of course, is to know yourself, and that's by making sure that you have a really good internal set of systems to monitor. Okay, let's continue with the people theme. Now, social engineering is defined as the psychological manipulation of people to give information. Any idea of how many attacks actually use this? More than half are actually non-technical attacks. So a few years back, one morning, a group of strangers walked into a shipping company, and within an hour they'd walked out with the organisation's entire data. How did they do that? Well, they researched the company for a couple of days. They found out the name of some of its people and when they were and weren't going to be there by phoning HR and asking about holidays, and by surfing the website. They then went and sat in the cafe outside and worked out who was coming in to buy their coffee, and they made themselves familiar to those people. And after a couple of days, they followed them in, they dropped the right names, they'd forgotten their pass at their desk, and they tailgated straight into the organisation. They knew that the CFO was off on holiday. They marched into the CFO's office. As part of their research, they'd listened to the CFO's last investor broadcast, and they'd practiced impersonating his voice. So they phoned the IT help desk. I've forgotten my password. Can you do a reset for me? In a familiar voice from the CFO's own phone extension. And that was it. They were in. They walked straight out with all the data. Now, fortunately, they were a consultancy company that the CFO had paid to test the security of the organisation. But I have to tell you, I would not have wanted to have been the head of security or the head of IT in that company that day. All right, so there's a key message here, which is before spending lots of money on firewalls, encryption, antivirus, and everything else, and yes, you do need to do that, the very first thing that you need to do is to train Dave, your employee, because he probably is the weakest link. Okay, so we reached the point where we need to change direction a little bit in this lecture. But before I do, I just wanted to check, is anyone else giving a presentation today? Maybe you need a USB stick. Yeah, Dave, you fancy having this one? Mark, isn't it? Thank you very much. There you are, Mark. Okay, so mission control. This is Big Bertha. Mission accomplished, weapons deployed, and returning to base. I've just given him one of the most dangerous cyber weapons known to man. Why is that? Because if I want to hack your company, I'll get a USB pen, I'll put your logo on it, I'll download your last company annual report, and I'll try and get it into your building. Maybe through one of your cleaners, the guy filling the vending machine, maybe I'm a visitor. I'll drop it in the toilet, maybe by the photocopier, or even the stationery cupboard, because you'd expect to find one there, wouldn't you? I'll bet you within a day someone will have picked it up. Oh, that's useful. Always need one of those. They'll have plugged it into their machine. Their machine will be already logged onto your corporate network, and bingo, the rat phones home. The remote access Trojan that I buried on that USB stick. The one you didn't notice because all you could see was your own company documents. So, I couldn't believe it actually last week. One of the organisers for one of the investor trade shows here in the UK, I won't name them, I'll spare their bosses, was trying to sell me a stand at their conference. And they said, it's going to be great. here's your cost-benefit analysis. This is a nice picture of what your stand will look like. And they sent it to me on a USB stick. And I just thought, excuse me, you've sent a random USB stick to the CEO of a cybersecurity company. Really? If you don't know where it's been, put it in the bin. Now, Mark, you better give me back that unexploded bomb. But for being a good sport, I've got you one that's still sealed, shrink wrapped, cannot have been tampered with. If you don't know where it's been, put it in the bin. All right, so it's really, really important to train your staff in social engineering and not to believe the email from the CEO demanding immediate supplier payment. Hostility is a great tool. If you want to tailgate someone in the building, get on your mobile phone, have an argument as you walk up to the door. No one wants to challenge an angry person. 90% of the time you walk straight in. And if they do challenge you, it's, oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the phone, bad supplier, I've just left it in the car, I'll go and get it. Wait 5 minutes and try again. And it really is that simple. Because we're all people of habits. And they use those habits against us. Now, if you remember Gareth, our script kiddie, he doesn't get out much, does he? So I've put up there the kind of top 5 things that social engineers tend to use against us. They gather information, they use hostility, they read our body language. Can anyone tell me what number 6 is? I promise you that a number of you will have already thought about this one several times this morning. Because it's sex. If you remember Gareth, he doesn't get out much. Just get someone to buy him a couple of drinks. Be nice to him. He'll think he's in, but he won't be. It'll be you who's in. So if you're like me, you're the wrong side of 50, you have put a few pounds on, and someone starts being really nice to you in the bar, just pause, because just maybe it's not your lucky day. So, the key point to all that is that you are going to get hacked. Yeah? You cannot stop them. They will get in. 81% of people last year. So you've got to assume that you're hacked, and you've got to prepare accordingly. You've got to lay your internal architecture, and you must have a cyber incident response plan. Tesco's responded quickly. That saved them. Yeah? Crest have a good one. The link is here, and I will send that to you. Make sure your organisation has one, and that it is rehearsed. Oh, and do go and have a look at the dark web. Your stuff might already be on sale. Okay, so let's just summarise what we've learnt from the mind of the hacker. So think people before technology. It's a better predictor, and make sure you invest in the security basics. They are winning, so you're going to have to run faster than your competitors, and think about their cost benefit, not yours. Everyone looks at that through the wrong end of the telescope. Everyone thinks about their losses. Don't. Think about the hacker's gain. They're leaking. Use threat intelligence. They boast about what they do on the dark web. Go and look. They hack in predictable ways. They hack in patterns that you can identify early. Make sure that you're looking for them. Make sure that you are monitoring. Make sure you disrupt their kill chain. They develop as people, predictably. We, as educators and law enforcers, can see people going through down the path. We need to make sure that we disrupt the highway to hell. And then finally, we've all got to assume that we're hacked anyway, and we need to prepare to respond. So, topic number 3, that's all the kind of background. What does all that mean for insurance? Or as the wags have it, insurance to protect something you can't touch from people you can't see. So, there are more experts in this room about cyber insurance than I will ever be. But here I think are the key questions which I will try and answer. And they are, so how big and how systemic is cyber risk? Is there a requirement for reinsurance? How will cyber insurance grow? How do I assess client risks? How do I check the cyber hygiene? How do I know that they will be prompt in monitoring and detecting And post-claim, what do I do to make sure that they did what they said? So let's start with how big and how ugly. And the reality is that the experts are divided. Davos thinks it's the biggest thing ever. Swiss Re say, well, it's borderline insurable, probably can do it. ZN think it's definitely insurable, but it does require reinsurance because of its size. And if you go to the London School of Economics, they just blow a raspberry at you. It's not systemic at all. They think the market's done a pretty good job with cyber exclusions. CL380, I think, is the one for the Lloyd's market. And also for the non-marine association, it's NMA 2914, I think, are the things that primarily prevent systemic risk. So if the experts can't agree, let's have a look at the numbers. What I've done here is compare some really major cyber potential events with some stuff that we've experienced, like Hurricane Katrina and Sandy. And what you see is that while cyber is big, a US blackout is estimated at about 20 billion insurable losses. It's not outside the experience of this marketplace in this building by any means. And even if you take the example of Deepwater Horizon, that cost, I think, BP 61 billion, of which around about 8 or 9, I understand, was insurable losses. Yeah, so that was bigger, maybe 3 times bigger than a US cyber blackout. And that didn't even bring down one company. So, if the big picture looks reasonably sanguine, what we need to do is to turn ourselves to the specific risk at every client. And for me, this is where the real issue lies. And a number of people have done a big study. There was one in the States between PwC and AIG, and they worked out that the average US breach cost about just under £6 million, so dollars. That's an insurable sum. It's not enormous. But what they then tried to do was to work out how do they assess the specific risk for each client. And they tried to look at size of client, they tried to look at number of records lost. And what you can see from this data is there's a huge number of hacks that cost almost nothing. And then there are 1 or 2 big ones. And so, my conclusion, if you do that, it's actually not really very helpful at all. It doesn't actually tell you what to do. And if we take Yahoo as the example, last December, they announced that they lost 1 billion records. The biggest customer breach ever. It included telephones, passwords, emails. Now, before the loss was announced, their share price was $40. Anyone got an idea of what it is now? $46. The market yawned. So there's a lot of phantom losses, a lot of scare out there. You really do need to understand the specific risks in every particular client. So how do you do that? And you do that by following a client through its cyber strategy, through what I call the cyber journey. And I've seen this many, many times. A customer of mine will start off by buying some antivirus, some appliances, some SEM, and on the basis of that, they'll have addressed their generic risks with some generic products. If you're a bank or online, that's not good enough. You go and do your specific risk study, you look at your corporate risks, and at that point they look pretty big and pretty scary. And at this point, it's about the cyber guy trying to argue for a budget. So they tend to come out with big numbers. But what happens is the corporation then goes through a corporate risk reduction exercise. They put in a number of measures, new firewalls, protection, and you end up in a situation where they've done a reasonably good job. They've protected themselves, and they just want to lay off some residual risk. You're going to get approached, I think, at 2 stages. You're going to get approached by people who are up here. You're going to be able to give them a pretty standard low-level insurance. The amount they're going to get back in the case of a loss is going to have to be capped because they actually haven't done the homework. And down here, well, the good news here is they've done their risk strategy. You've got a set of risks to assess, you understand their countermeasures, you know what standards they've met, and therefore they should be insurable. And how do you as non-experts assess that? Well, it's actually very simple, because there's a set of agreed standards already out there, and all you need to do is make sure that they've met the right standard for their level of residual risk. So some quick facts. How much is the market growing? About 2% of companies have cyber insurance in the UK at the moment, 13% in the US, so 13% for the mid-large and about 40% in the US. And if you connect that with the growth in the cyber potential and with the requirements for GDPR, I think the UK will very, very quickly follow the US. The market will actually grow enormously in the next 2 to 3 years. And if you look at what that cover is, because of the legal requirements in the States, there's about 100% coverage for liability. You have to have it. About 80% of that, 40% are covered for response costs, about 80% for extortion, and about 50% for business interruption. Those policies usually exclude stuff that's insured elsewhere, so tangible property is excluded, bodily injury, IPR, very, very difficult to insure because it's very, very difficult to price. But we are seeing emerging cover in the States for things like regulatory investigations, PCI DSS fines, customer reimbursement, and mass reissue of cards. But given that most of those exclusions, if you go to those policies, have actually got CL380 or the equivalent in, actually there's still quite a lot of open gaping holes in cyber insurance. A lot of people out there who are going to need cover who currently don't have it. And so I was absolutely delighted to hear that your estimate was the same as mine. About 3 billion now, current premiums for cyber. We're expecting that to reach about 15 by the early 2020s at around about 30 to 40% growth rate every year. Those figures are quoted from the Financial Times. Now, I've made great play today about cyber being more of a people than a technology thing. But the reality is, yes, there is technology there. You are going to need some technical skills. You are going to need advice on risks and countermeasures and standards to check that the client has got the right security standards in place and that the company has got support to monitor and rapidly mitigate its losses. So you are going to need to either partner to achieve those skills or, in the case of Beazley, for example, I think they've been quite far-sighted. They've decided to bring that capability in-house and actually have it right up close. I think that's a clever move. Okay, we're on the home straight now. I was asked to make a few comments about financial services and oil and gas. Well, in addition to everything I've spoken about, the FCA are driving huge boardroom accountability in financial services at the moment. They have their own special security standards for us to follow. They have a huge, what we call in the jargon, they have a huge attack surface. They've got online apps, mobile banking, payment through mobile phones, lots of ways that they can be hacked. And they've also got to work out how to do that across multiple different legal systems. So in many ways, financial services is the leading sector for defence against financially oriented cybercrime. And that's kind of not a surprise. Even Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, knew that when he was asked, why does he rob banks? Because that's where the money is. In oil and gas, it is a little bit different. They've got vulnerabilities in their operational systems and their SCADA and industrial control systems. They've got the challenge of having a large number of remote sites. It's actually physically difficult even just to secure your IT comms over that kind of network, a network which itself is insecure and prone to being hacked. And the losses are a bit different. They're not online money. It's about plant outages and production downtime. Another challenge is the culture. The culture is very different from financial services. It's a strong culture. It's been there for a long time, but it's not a culture that's used to dealing with cybercrime. And then finally, the motivation of hackers is a little bit different. Oil and gas companies are a little bit more prone to hacktivism perhaps than the banks because of environmental concerns. But there are standards, I should say, for you still to follow here. So the American Petroleum Institute, for example, have issued 1164. There is a best practice, and you can also get guidance from the UK Centre for the Protection of Critical National Infrastructure. So again, you don't have to be experts. There's guidance for you to check. So let's just answer the questions. How systemic, how large is cyber risk? It's big, but it's not unprecedented. Is there a requirement for reinsurance? Yes, there probably is at the top end. I would say the losses are big enough that you must. How will cyber insurance grow? At around about 30 to 40% per year. How do you assess client cyber risk? You use the standards. How do you check their cyber hygiene? And how do you make sure that they respond promptly? Again, it's about have they observed their standards and afterwards going in to do a cyber audit. Did they really do what they said? Or did they just abuse because of moral hazard? You need to know that. And then finally, because it's so variable, the losses are so variable, you are going to have to do specific assessment for losses. You can't get away from that unless you're just going to do a standard quote. So that's really it for the talk today. Here are the headlines. Number one, there is explosive growth in cyber and cyber insurance. Number two, yes, the technology is complex, it is evolving, and it does require expertise. The management of cyber risk is still not very widespread. 98% of UK companies do not have cyber insurance. 69% of companies do not have any kind of cyber plan. But the way to think about it, the way to actually predict and manage this, is to think about people before the technology. The specific risks can be hard to size. You don't get away from having to do that particular piece of homework. But you can deal with it by either standard terms or doing your specific assessment followed by reinsurance. And the net is it has to be a huge opportunity, quite possibly the single biggest opportunity in Lloyd's for the next 4 or 5 years. But it does require carefully thought out offers. Thank you very much.